Good morning, everyone. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives presentation of email preservation and transfer. Today's presenter is Monica Hauck-Whealton. Monica is the New York State Archives Records Advisory Officer for counties, libraries, and miscellaneous government. This session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box to the right side of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of this presentation. And at this point in time, I will turn the presentation over to Monica.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, everyone, also for attending today. As Rich said, I'm the Records Advisory Officer who assists counties, libraries, and miscellaneous governments like soil and water districts and housing authorities to achieve their records management goals and face their challenges. Before that, I worked with state agencies in our Scheduling and State Agency Services unit, and prior to that, I was a records management officer for 8 years at a state agency. Today, we're going to talk about email preservation and transfer. Now, we're going to break that up into two sections. In about approximately the first half of the presentation, we're going to talk about emails as records, and specifically as permanent or archival records. We're going to talk about identifying those records and who is responsible for ensuring that they remain accessible for the full period of retention, which in this case is, of course, permanently. We're also going to talk about challenges associated with maintaining access to those emails for that permanent period of time so that staff and researchers are able to use them. And then finally, we're going to have a case study where we talk about the state archives process for ensuring that the emails that are transferred to us remain accessible going forward. This presentation has two different audiences and two purposes. Local governments are responsible for preserving the permanent emails that they create and receive in the course of business. And they may be interested in adapting the process the state archives uses to preserve their records. State agencies, on the other hand, transfer their records to the New York State Archives for preservation. Our staff are responsible for making sure that those records remain accessible both to agency staff and to researchers. The agencies may be interested in learning how we protect those records to ensure that they remain accessible. Now, before we get too far into this, just very briefly, yes, emails can be records. Whether something is a record or not is based upon its function and its content rather than its format. If the same information is in a paper document or a database or an email or an audio file, they can all be records. And the only real difference is that depending on the format, you're going to face different challenges for making sure that they remain accessible for the full required retention period. Now, not all records obviously need to be kept for a long time. Some records can be disposed of when no longer needed, after 6 years, for example, but certain records, about 5% of all government records created across all government types in New York State, need to be kept permanently, and those are referred to as either permanent or archival records. That concentration is going to differ by entity. Some may have much higher percentage than 5% they need to keep permanently, and others may have fewer than 5% that need to be retained in perpetuity. So how do you identify these 5% records? If you're a local government, the records that are scheduled for permanent retention are listed in the LGS-1 with a retention of permanent. You may also have other record types that have a minimum retention period that's a finite amount of time, but your government decides that for administrative purposes or because they're ongoing historical or research value, those records should be kept permanently. Information about that retention requirement should be within your office retention schedules. If you encounter records that you believe should be retained longer than what's in the LGS-1, including records that may need to be retained permanently, talk to your records management officer or talk to state archive staff. We will be able to assist you. State agencies should consult either the general schedule or their agency-specific schedules. Within the general schedule, records that are considered archival will have a retention of transfer to the state archives. In the agency-specific schedules, records are going to have a disposition of either transfer to state archives or other, where a portion of the records are transferred to the archives. As with everything in life, there are challenges related to preserving your email records. We're going to talk about 3 different categories of challenges: those related to the format of the records as email, those related to the content of the records, and those related to the fact that people are people, and sometimes we do things that are counterintuitive or make life more difficult for ourselves and our colleagues. Regarding format, one of the major differences about email records is that they do not exist as a physical object. With a paper record, you're going to have a piece of paper, and it's going to have ink upon it, and that ink is the information within the record. Whether you dispose of all the source materials for that paper record, as long as you retain access to that paper record, you've got all the information within it. Emails, on the other hand, are a collection of data that is then used by a template to display that content in an easy-to-read format. If some of the data is damaged or lost, or if the template is damaged, you're not necessarily going to be able to access that information. And just because that information is not easy to read in a template, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There is additional data associated with each email, and loss of that information can inhibit your ability to continue to access that email. Emails as electronic files also can be saved in different file types. And depending on whether that is a common file type or proprietary file type may impact your ability to access those files. You're also going to be concerned about the different file types used for attachments in emails, because in order to retain accessibility, you're going to have to make sure that you can access those different file types. As time goes by, you may decide that you want to use a different email provider or a different application to access your email. If you want to be able to move your email from one provider or application to another, it's very possible, but it's another challenge. It's going to be a little bit of a pain in the neck. You're going to have to plan the process and implement it using staff with the right skills. And it's something that you're not going to want to go into lightly without a certain amount of planning and advanced procedures. And then finally, emails, because of what they are, you may have one person send them to 5 different people, and then 3 of them respond. So, and then 2 of them send them off to only a select number of people on the list. So you may have many copies of an email, and you may not have a specific sender or recipient for each copy. So when you're determining who holds the official copy, emails can be a bit more challenging than, say, a paper document or a database. Emails have, like any type of record, various types of content. And that means that you are going to have both personal content and very important long-term content and everything in between in one format. And staff are not necessarily going to mark their emails to indicate what type of content it is and what the retention requirement is. You're also going to encounter issues where emails are sometimes used as envelopes that are used to convey attachments or links to a shared document on a document management system or on a LAN, or also links to websites. So you're going to have to consider whether you're going to be able to continue to access those attachments, the linked documents, or the websites. And if an email is permanent, you may have to think about how you can save a copy of that information so that it can remain associated with the email. Because if that is the meat of the email, the most important information that is conveying, and you lose it, suddenly the email is stripped of its value. And I mentioned the human factor. People are people. We do all kinds of things that make life difficult for ourselves and each other. Many of us use email for a great percentage of our business correspondence. And that means that some of us get kind of attached to it and lose sight of the fact that these are government records and they need to be retained in accordance with the retention requirements. So people may decide that, well, yes, it has a retention period of 6 years, but I want to keep it forever, just in case it comes up again, because I want to be able to whip that email out and check the information within it and, save the day, or, just make sure that I don't forget anything. People may also decide that, well, this is my stuff. I don't want to transfer it to, the RMO or to the state archives for preservation. And sometimes as a records management officer or records management staff, you need to be able to, just understand people's concerns and their attachments to their email and, help them decide that it is time to let go, to let the little baby bird email leave the nest and go on so that it remains accessible going forward. Staff also tend to create their own filing schemes. And some of those filing schemes may be very logical, where if that person won the lottery or retired and one of their colleagues had to access the records, they'd be able to go through and say, oh, this is all very logical. I understand what's going here. I can find the documents we need. Sometimes, though, those filing schemes are a bit more individualized, and it can be difficult both for colleagues and for staff who are processing permanent or archival email to determine exactly what series records fall in or how they're grouped together. And some staff don't really do filing at all. They depend on keyword searches, on filtering by email or topic, and that can, again, be a challenge when you're identifying permanent or archival email and processing them for future access. Staff also, in some organizations, are responsible for filtering emails and applying retention requirements. And either through, lack of education or lack of time or perceptions of what they think that should be done rather than the retention requirement, staff may not routinely or consistently apply retention requirements correctly or transfer records as required. So you're going to want to consider as an organization whether you need to give staff training, whether you need to figure out a different way to retain records. Some organizations save a copy of every email that is sent or received before staff even have the ability to go through and weed through the emails to determine what is important and what is not. You need to figure out what's useful for your organization, and if you have any questions or concerns or just want to bounce ideas, talk to us at the State Archives. We're always happy to help. Now, we're not going to go into these challenges in detail as part of this presentation, but if you have questions or if you want advice, definitely contact State Archive staff. We're available to help you. And Rich, can you put the link for the staff contact information in the chat, please?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, different organizations retain their email in different formats. You might want to save it as emails. And if you were doing that, you could save it within your email application. You might drag it into folders on your local area network, your hard drive, or in a document management system. Or you might keep it in a digital preservation application. Another alternative is to convert it to another format. You could print it as a TIFF or a PDF-A and store in any of those storage locations. You could print a hard copy and interfile it with your paper records on the same topic, or you can copy and paste the email to a word processing document. There are plenty of other ways to reformat records as necessary, whether they're emails or some other type of electronic record. But at the State Archives, we decided to retain the emails that are transferred to us by state agencies as emails. And there are certain benefits to that. One of the most important is that if you're retaining the email in its original format, that means that you're retaining all the metadata associated with that email. Now, metadata is information about information. It's all that little bit of background data that's used to fill out the template that you read as an email. But in addition to the subject, the body text, the sender, the recipient, and the time sent and received, there's all sorts of other information in the background, including data that confirms all of that information, the sent, the received. So if somebody tries to say, oh, I didn't actually send that on the 20th, I sent it on the 15th, you would be able to go into the metadata and say, no, it looks like this actually did go out on the 20th. And there are cases, for example, if you're undergoing litigation where it may be very important to verify that that email has not been changed, that it is the content that was originally sent or received and when that was sent or received. When you save emails as emails, you can also retain the association of the email with its attachments. That can be important because I have to say, as a former records access officer, when you split them apart and have to join them back together again, there's plenty of room for error, and it's simply a laborious, time-intensive process. If you can actually just ensure that the attachments never lose their connection to the email, you don't have to worry about the email losing its informational value because the reference documents cannot be found. With emails, as I said, you may have multiple senders and multiple recipients as the email is written back and forth to each other and as the conversation evolves. If you keep the email as an email, sometimes you can retain that threading. So instead of having 10 emails that are related to each other and having to go through and check the sent and receive date to trace how it traveled, you might be able to retain that as one thread, which makes it easier to access it and review it. And then if you keep emails as emails, you can take advantage of the search functionality within the application or within the system in which you're saving it. So for example, you can sort by all emails sent by Jane Engineer to John Architect on project number 16250. As with everything in life, though, there are also some challenges to saving emails as emails. I mentioned before that some applications use a proprietary format. So for example, many state agencies use Microsoft Outlook for their email. And if you want to export somebody's Outlook email box, that's going to be exported as a PST file, which is a proprietary format that might not necessarily be read by another application. You're also going to want to consider whether over time you're no longer using a specific application to read your email or to create the documents that you attach to emails, your spreadsheets, your Word documents, and whatnot. You're going to be concerned about making sure that those attachments and those emails can be opened 5, 10, 15 years down the line. You don't want to run into the issue that I did with some of the records that I created in the 90s, where technically I could still access those, but because the application I created them in, AmiPro, is no longer supported, I would have to jump through many hoops to be able to access those records. And if they're business records, you might have to do that. Thankfully, with my previous academic records, it would only be out of curiosity, and I don't have to go through that process. Depending on how you're saving your email records, you may have difficulty applying retention schedules to those files. And then, again, if your emails are being retained as email and being managed by the staff who send or receive them, you have to be concerned about whether the retention schedules are being honored and whether staff are choosing to retain the records as necessary or either accidentally or purposefully deleting them prior to the end of the retention period. Second part of the presentation starts now. We're going to talk about how the state archives preserves the records that are transferred to us in email format. This is all the result of the work of the State Archives Emails Management Team, which met from 2020 to 2021. We were charged with determining how to manage the records sent to the state archives by state agencies in email format. I was a member of the team representing our government record services staff. We had multiple goals. First, we needed to develop processes for acquiring, describing, and providing access to email records. We also needed to be able to look at what was transferred to us, identify which ones were permanent records, and then sort, organize, and manage them. And then finally, we had to ensure that when staff or researchers requested copies of those emails, we could identify which ones were responsive to the request, identify the restricted content within them, and then redact as necessary to ensure that only the content that should be released would be released. We didn't actually go through the project in a chronological order as shown here, but the easiest way to describe it is to go through project phases. So first, we had to identify which records we were going to use as a test case for transferring, processing, and preserving the records. We then had to orchestrate that transfer, determine whether we needed to convert the records to a new format in order to process them, and then finally preserve them so that access would be available going forward. In order to meet these goals, we identified 3 types of tools that we would be using. A tool for converting the record from one format to another, a tool for processing those records, and we'll get into what exactly that means in a few minutes, and then a tool used to store those records so that they would remain accessible over time. First, we had to identify what records we were going to use for our test case. We ended up using records belonging to what are called capstone record series. Those are series where you look at individuals within an organization and bucket records together based upon the type of work done or the responsibilities of the individual who creates or receives them. For example, you may decide that all of the records of your superintendent or your commissioner or the sheriff need to be retained for a certain amount of time, whereas all the records of an entry-level office assistant may only need to be retained for a very short period of time compared to those of executive staff. We specifically looked at capstone series related to subject and correspondence of former leadership, and specifically those of former Education Department commissioners and of a state historian. Why these individuals? Well, because they were in leadership positions, there was a higher likelihood that their emails would contain permanent and archival records. They were also series that are transferred after the individual who creates and receives the records leaves the organization. So that meant that we did not have to be concerned about proprietary feelings towards the emails by their former owner. And then finally, the State Archives is located within the Education Department. We already have strong working relationships with the staff who would be responsible for identifying and transferring the emails of former commissioners and of the former state historian. For logistical purposes, it made sense to work within the system within which we were already comfortable and where we already had the necessary contacts to transfer the records. Once we had identified the records, it was time to transfer them. And there is no one right way to do this. Even within the archives, depending on the volume of records, the technical abilities of the organization that is transferring them, and the types of records, we use different methodologies. If it's only a few emails, we may ask you to drag them as attachments to another email and send them that way. We may ask you to use CDs, DVDs, flash drives to transfer them, or we may go a completely electronic route. We may talk about document management sites like SharePoint or FTP transfer. It really makes sense to take a step back and consider what the best transfer option is for this particular type of record, and this particular batch of records. If you're a state agency and you're looking to transfer to the state archives, you're going to want to contact my colleagues in Archival Services at archivestransfer@nised.gov, and they will help you determine the best way to transfer that particular set of records to the archives. If you're a local government, always feel free to reach out to your Records Advisory Officer, and we can talk about options that may be available to you. So once we finally have the records in hand, we have a big decision to make. Do we want to use a processing program that is compatible with the format the records came in, or do we want to convert those records so that they can be used in another processing program? Well, the records we transferred were created and exported from Outlook. So those came as PST files, which is not necessarily going to allow us a great deal of latitude when we choose a processing program. So we decided to adopt a secondary resource to convert those PST files to MBOX, which is a much more commonly used format and would open up our options for choosing processing software. We chose Bit Curator as our format conversion tool. It was created by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and its partners. It's a free and open source tool, but the challenges to using it are that you need to run it in Linux. It's not available through Mac or Windows, and it's a fairly complicated tool. It is actually capable of doing so much more than converting file formats, but that's the only thing we used it for in this case. And staff needed to have specialized skills and resources able to utilize Bit Curator. Our team had 4 members, and only 2 of them actually interacted with Bit Curator. They had it installed on their computers, and they were the ones who completed this part of the process. The rest of the team simply waited until the records were in the proper format to process before accessing them. Once the emails were in MBOX format, it was time to process them. What does that mean? Well, first of all, we had to go in and appraise the records. We had to determine what types of records were they? Were they even records? What series did they fall within? How could we categorize them and describe them to make sure that our colleagues and researchers would be able to identify what was contained within the records and whether they were of interest or not. Then we went through and we tagged the records to make it easier to identify what they were in the future. We would say this is related to this particular series or this particular content, and also identify records that might need to be redacted prior to release. We were also able to weed or tag the emails that were non-records or those that were records that met their retention requirements. And then finally, certain processing software will allow you to provide public access through that software. We chose a product called ePad for our processing needs. It's a product of Stanford University and its partners. Like Bit Curator, it's free and open source, but it's much more user-friendly. You can use Mac or Windows to access it, and honestly, when I was using ePad to process our records in our test case, after a very brief training, I was able to go through and filter the records or recategorize them and apply tags so that I could identify content by keyword or by foldering structure or by many other criteria, just to identify what we had, what needed to be retained, and how we needed to identify it for future reference. Now, the problem is that we did have to do a lot of filtering and identification and review and tagging, because just because an email falls within a subject and correspondence series of leadership within the organization doesn't mean that everything within those emails are going to be permanent or archival records. For example, I know I'm guilty of it occasionally. Sometimes we got emails that are a little bit more personal, whether it's setting up, meeting a colleague for coffee, or whether it's, reminding yourself that you've got a hair appointment that you need to go to. Those are not going to be content that you need to keep permanently. You may also have emails that belong to series with limited retention periods. For example, the individuals whose emails we reviewed were also supervisors. So you would find requests from the staff reporting to them to take their leave, or report that they were going to be going to the dentist. And that is not something that needs to be retained permanently. And thankfully, because of the length of time between when those requests came in and when the records were transferred to us, they had actually exhausted their retention periods and could be disposed of. We also found emails containing protected content, some of it related to personnel and some related to other matters. And we wanted to be able to tag that so that when our colleagues were required to, at some future point, prepare those records for release in response to a FOIL request, a researcher request, or possibly litigation, that they would be able to do so in a timely manner. So we had, as I said, we had to go through these emails and figure out what was permanent, what was archival, and what was not. And in order to make it easier, we went through and determined which series might be found within the transferred emails, and then educated processing staff on those series. We then were able to weed or tag the records by the retention requirements associated with them, based upon keyword searches, or in relation to the sensitivity of the content and whether it might need to be redacted prior to release. Then, once we knew what we had and we had marked it with tags to make it easier to identify in the future, it was time to make sure that it would remain accessible going forward. As with the methodologies for choosing your tools for processing your emails, there are different methodologies for preserving your emails. You might want to choose preservation software that's specifically designed for ensuring that content remains available going forward. You could also choose to instead have a process by which you migrate and upgrade those records. So for example, if you are using a word processing program that is updated every few years to a new version, you will want to consider creating and saving an updated version of the files that are attached to your emails so that they can be opened with the new version of that word processing program. You may also want to consider whether, if a particular application is no longer being supported, you want to create a version of that file that can be accessed by a new application that is currently being supported and that the organization is going to be using going forward. A few things that you're not going to want to do are consider your backups as your preservation copies. Backups are not only created for short-term access in the case of a disaster, but they are also meant to pull large volumes of records that have been inadvertently destroyed or made inaccessible. It's not going to be easy to pull copies of a specific email from a backup, so you're really not going to want to follow that process. You're also not going to want to store your preservation copies on external media, because not only can those be lost or misplaced or stolen, unfortunately, but they also have a limited lifespan, and you're not always going to have a warning when they start to degrade. So if you store content that needs to be kept permanently on CDs, DVDs, or other external media, you may have a very bad surprise someday when you try to access them and realize that they're no longer accessible, even if you can find the media upon which they were stored. The State Archives chose to use digital storage and preservation software, and that affords a lot of value. For example, many software types allow you to migrate files to a newer format for continued accessibility, while also keeping them in the original format. That means that if the metadata is changed or some does not convert over when you bring it to a new format, as resources develop and as better ways of transferring content are created, you can go back to the original and create a cleaner, more complete version of that file. You can also use digital storage software to view files that are saved in outdated formats. So again, if I'm going back to those papers that I wrote in the 90s, I might be able to use the preservation software to read those without having to jump through those hoops of converting it to a new format. Digital storage software can also be used to protect against file loss or corruption, and it will check for viruses and other malware to make sure that those documents do not change over time, and either to become accessible or to simply lose certain aspects of the data associated with them. You can also use the software to verify that the document has not been changed. I mentioned the metadata before and how someone may decide that they want to represent that they sent something before they actually did. You will be able to use the preservation software to make sure, no, this is the copy that was created and added to the system on this date. No one has done anything to modify it, and it has not inadvertently been modified. And then, as I said, when you're verifying the authenticity, you're verifying that you are retaining the metadata associated with that email, so that as you're using that metadata to create the template email and read it again, you know all the content that you need is going to be there. Some digital storage software can also be used to provide public access to the records identified as accessible by the staff using the software. The State Archives chose to use Preservica. Now, this was an easy choice for us because we're already using Preservica for our electronic records, and staff are already familiar with it. Unfortunately, this is not an open source or free service. It's commercially available, and the fee structure varies by edition and storage capacity. The State Archives is going to be having a webinar late this year where we talk in more detail about preservation of digital records. And if you're interested in more information about how we use Preservica, you're going to want to consider registering for that presentation, which is a great time, makes this a great time to plug the fact that we advertise our webinars on our website. So you can visit the registration page to see what's coming up, or even better, you can sign up for one of our newsletters and receive announcements of presentations and resources that are coming available. And Rich, could you post a link to those in the chat, please?
Sure did, Monica.
Thank you very much. Now, this is the part where I have to give a disclaimer. The State Archives does not endorse specific products or vendors. These tools that I just spoke about are the ones that work for us, and they're the ones that work for us right now. As we work with them more extensively, as we see how different products evolve over time and become available, we may decide to adopt additional tools. And even if we do decide to maintain use of these tools, they may not be the right ones for you. So please, if you're interested in learning more about these tools, if you're interested in learning about other alternative procedures or resources, contact the State Archives. If you're a state agency, talk to my colleagues in state agency services, or if you're a local government, contact your records advisory officer. We're here to help you to tease out your exact situation and what tools and resources are going to help you meet your goals. So, time is coming for questions, but in closing, before we get there, some emails are permanent or archival records, and Depending on whether you're a local government or a state agency, you're going to have a different responsibility related to those. Local governments are responsible for preserving their permanent records in-house, while state agencies should contact the state archives to arrange transfer of those records so that we can preserve them. There are all sorts of methodologies and tools available to help you preserve your permanent archival records, whether they're emails or databases or word process documents, audio-visual records. And state archive staff can help you identify your particular set of challenges and potential resources that you can use to manage those records. Of course, if you want to talk to state archive staff, you need our contact information. We have the link in the chat, but I'm also going to leave this up for a moment so that you can take down the contact information for the individuals that work with you. For state agencies, you're going to want to contact the Scheduling and State Agency Services Unit at recmgmt@nised.gov. For cities, fire districts, and New York City municipal agencies, you're going to want to talk to Maria McCashin. I'm the contact information for counties, libraries, and miscellaneous governments. Sarah Durling deals with all things educational, school districts, BOCES, community colleges, and teacher centers. Michael Martin works with towns. And Villages and Cornell Cooperative Extensions have the honors of working with my colleague Lorraine Hill. And this information is available on our website through the link in the chat. And now we've reached the point where we get to talk about your questions. Rich, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yes, we sure do, Monica. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my document here where I transcribed a lot of them. Okay, I had a question from Tom earlier about, this is when you were talking retention and disposition of email. He asked, how long do we need to keep them? And then he kind of added to that, says, maintaining systems that could possibly be not available to open products is not sustainable. But I'm not sure if they're connected necessarily, but, and I can certainly repeat those questions for you.
Well, because whether something is a record is based upon its function rather than its format, some emails are going to need to be retained for a lengthy period of time. And as an organization, you're going to need to decide whether you want to retain those in the electronic format as an email, or if you want to consider converting it to another format. It's really a balance of whether you think it's worth maintaining metadata. In many circumstances is going to be, but it's really, a personal decision based upon your organization's capabilities. But there are resources available to ensure that you will be able to maintain access to those electronic records in an electronic format going forward, and we can help you identify those.
Yes, and actually Tom happens to be with a county, so I suggested to him that he contact you directly as the records advisory officer for counties.
Fantastic. I look forward to hearing from you, Tom.
Okay, Daniel asked, is it reasonable to classify individual emails? How much time does this take? We have 6,000 employees at my agency.
You may end up needing to bucket the emails fairly broadly. Like, for example, if you have emails related to a particular project, you may determine that all records related to that project need to be kept for, say, 6 years after project completion, depending on the type of record and the type of project. But yes, classifying individual emails can be very difficult, and you may simply need to determine how to use the metadata within the emails, whether it's the project number listed or the sender or recipient, or information about how that content is used to create large buckets and organize them based upon that. Or you may be reliant upon project staff to drag emails to folders on the LAN or in their email inboxes. Or one item I like is there are certain document management systems where you can actually, as you're sending an email, CC a folder within a document management system, so it's automatically going to populate within the correct folder with the correct retention period based upon the content within the email.
Okay, and Daniel also asked, was there an initial classification of employees to roles, or only the emails from policymakers reviewed?
We specifically looked at record series that related to individuals because of their role, but we can work with you to talk about how, the types of records created by different individuals within an organization. Like, for example, in the LGS1, you're going to have a lot of records that are only really created by people in a personnel position, or people who are working in fiscal, or people who are in executive positions. And the State Archives record series aren't a purely capstone set of series. Not every record type is going to be related to a specific individual, but we can help you identify what types of records are being created and how to associate them with individuals, or how to determine the best way to identify and collect those records from the staff who create and receive them.
Okay, see, Maria asks, what was the amount of emails reviewed in the case study?
That would have been a really good thing to look up before this presentation, and unfortunately I did not. But I know that it spanned a number of years and that the commissioner emails spanned multiple individuals. So it was a fairly large set of emails, and that if we had not had the ability to filter them by keyword, by the foldering structure, it would have been much more difficult to process them as quickly as we did.
Okay, and we had a similar question from Marion as well, about just wondering how many emails were processed. Maria asks, how often were attachments unique and not stored elsewhere?
That is also something that we did not follow up on, since this was simply a test case for ensuring that records could be saved and that the association with the attachments could be maintained. But that is something that would be fantastic to set within organizational policy to determine whether every significant file kept within the system that is sent as part of an email should be retained within the system for a set period of time based upon the content type. You could, for example, say that the copy that is saved to your document management system or your local area network is the official copy, and that that's the one that needs to be retained for retention purposes, and that the email is only an envelope. But it really depends on the function of the email itself. If the email, for example, is documentation that you shared that content across staff, like, for example, how we're all required to receive training on avoiding workplace violence, you may want to keep a copy of that email to document the dissemination of that official copy, even if the official copy is maintained elsewhere.
And Maria asked also, did the case study result in a template for future transfers?
We did create guidance documents for State Archive staff on how to initiate a transfer and how to process the records once they were transferred. We also created resources for state agency staff to consult when transferring records to the State Archives. And if you have questions about those, or if you'd like to review copies of them, contact me.
And we have a question here. How long should an individual have access to their emails before they are moved to an archival area?
It really depends on how often the individuals need to access those records for administrative purposes. Like, for example, if somebody is working on a project and once the project is concluded, they do not need to touch those records anymore, it might make sense to have all project records remain accessible by that individual for X amount of time after project conclusion, and then they're locked for deletion. But again, that is an internal policy where it really depends upon how staff relate to their records and how dependable they can be to retain the records. Like, for example, my inbox, I'm able to access those records for the full retention period. And hopefully, because I work in records management and give records management guidance, I can be trusted to ensure that nothing is disposed of before the end of its retention period. But this is one of those many things with records management where there are all sorts of ways that you can make sure that records remain accessible and determine when the records should be locked down, and there's no one solution that works for everyone.
Okay. Let's see if there are any other questions. I don't see any. Laura asks, she's just wondering, she said, this may be out of the scope of the topic, but is there a reason why the New York State Archives website does not start the URL with HTTPS?
Yes, that is actually something that is, it came up in an email yesterday, a few days ago, and I can't recall what the reasoning was behind that, but it is something that our IT staff are aware of. And I understand that it can create frustration when you're trying to access items on our website.
Yeah, I guess, maybe we can get the answer to that from our digital strategies unit and put that into a newsletter or something. A little factoid, I suppose, or at least a little explain to people why it's like that.
That's a good idea, Rich.
That's me. I'm an ideas guy. So, anyway, just kind of say, speaking of ideas, does anybody have any other questions here? We've got about 10 minutes left, so there's plenty of time. Did have some comments from folks saying thank you for the presentation.
But as we're waiting for questions, email, of course, as new resources come available, we may be moving away from it a little bit, like some of the chats back and forth that we would have an email. Now that we're using all sorts of other resources, as we're not necessarily working down the hall from our colleagues every day, are taking the place of some of those more casual emails. So we may be creating fewer of those non-record or short-term record emails. But I have a feeling that at least as long as my generation is still working, we are still going to be reliant upon them to transmit information back and forth, both of the long-term value type and those that are of transitory value. So if you have any questions about maintaining your emails, and just from when I was working in state agencies, I know that this was a constant challenge that we faced. Please don't be shy to reach out.
Well, I don't see any other questions.
Well, I know that Rich has has posted the contact information. So if you have any questions after the presentation, please don't hesitate to contact State Agency Services or your Records Advisory Officer, because that's what we're here for. We're here to help you reach your records management goals and face any challenges related to content, whether they be emails or paper records or whatnot.
All right, well, thanks everybody for your participation.
Thanks for joining us today.